So welcome everyone. Happy Veterans Day. A thank you to all veterans past and present who have served our nation. My name is Joyska Nunez Medina. I'm in community engagement at the Tennessee State Museum, and we will lead to our November Lunch and Learn. General housekeeping, I'm sure many of you know the ground rules, but you should be muted. If you called in, make sure your phone's on mute. And if you have any questions at any point, the chat bubble should be on the bottom right-hand side. If you press the chat, the little text box should come up and have that set to all panelists so we can get your questions. So now to our guest today. We have Dr. Daryl Carter back to talk to us about women in their role in politics in World War I and then after. Dr. Daryl Carter is a professor of history at Eastern Tennessee State University, and he specializes in 20th and 21st century political history and the role, the intersections of race, class, and gender play in that history. So, Dr. Carter, please take it away. Can't wait to hear what you have to share with us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for setting this up, and I thank all of you for attending. I'd like to take a brief moment to just say how grateful I am for all the veterans, past and present, who served the country, who have protected us and protected our rights and freedoms. And God bless their families for the struggles that they also have to put up with when their loved ones are serving abroad. So happy Veterans Day to everyone. Thank you for giving me this time. I'm going to speak just for a little while about women in politics and women in Tennessee. And so when we think about this, I want to start here at World War I, where this is such a really big, important event. Number one, we see the breakdown of all these empires. We see the introduction of new ones. We see the beginning of what will be a path towards eventually Nazism in Germany. And of course, the United States will backtrack a little bit into the 1920s in key ways, racially, politically, et cetera. But by the 1930s, they will once again take on a much more progressive and or liberal direction in terms of politics, culture, et cetera. So when we think about World War I, this is the event that really kind of does a number of things. One, it breaks down a lot of people, particularly on the European side, but also here in the United States, breaks down this belief in progress and human reason. The idea that problems can be solved, that scientific management can be used to deal with problems. And so, World War I has that effect of saying, yeah, you can to a certain extent, but you can still lead yourself into irrational behavior, emotional behavior which kills millions of people, despite all of your human advancement. It's also a period in which we see further development of the United States infrastructure and government. I'm specifically thinking about the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve. I'm thinking about the United States involvement in the private sector. I'm thinking about the use of propaganda. I think about George Krill, and I think about the issue of activism. And so when I'm thinking about activism, what I want you to think about is the issue of civil rights, number one, and number two, the issue of women's rights and specifically suffrage. And so as we consider, what the condition of women looks like in 1917, 1918, 1919, women by and large in the United States are second-class citizens. By that, I mean they do not enjoy the same constitutional and or state rights that men do. So, for example, this includes most prominently the issue of voting. Also, issues of property, issues of, protection from sexual abuse, issues regarding who can hold various pieces of land, inter contracts, things of that nature. And of course, being segregated in terms of work experiences, things of that nature. So women are by no stretch equal. They are inferior from a legal standpoint at that time, but not for long. It's going to develop here during the First World War, where the push for suffrage really hits that high watermark, right? In terms of getting popular support for it and getting institutional support in the state houses, as well as the Congress and ultimately the White House. And so Tennessee women are going to play a role in that. They're going to play an important role in that, especially when it comes to rallying people to get behind and support the 19th Amendment. We see women from Knoxville, women from the Tri-Cities, women from Chattanooga, from Nashville, from Memphis, and from other places in the state who are going to help lead that charge, okay? And so as you're thinking about, okay, what are women going to do? Number one, they're going to be actively involved to the extent that they can in all matters of public debate regarding this, okay? Much like their counterparts in other parts of the country, as well as in Washington, adding not legislative, but I should say political pressure to elected officials to support women's suffrage, okay? And so there's an incredible amount of activity in the state of Tennessee regarding this, both for and against. One way that you see this is people who are arguing against it. So let me start with the people who don't want it. Some of these people are bigots. They think if women are allowed to vote, it'll eventually lead to Black people and Black women voting. Some of them don't like it because they consider it improper for women to engage in the political sphere. Other people don't like it because simply it adds the number of people they have to appeal to get elected to public office. Some people think that there's religious aspects to it. So the anti-suffrage movement is alive and well in Tennessee, and it is supported not just by people that 100 years later in 2020 would consider bigoted or sexist or misogynistic, but also a lot of women who question whether this was the appropriate thing to do. And so by 1920, especially when you get to the summer of 1920, there is a lot of I think intense is the best word to say, activity in and around Nashville around this issue of suffrage, and demanding that, either women get it or women don't get it. And so women are going to be involved in everything from the debates on this to advocacy for it to lobbying individuals in the legislatures for it. The most famous one is probably going to be Harry T. Byrne from NIDA, who is going to change his vote to support it in no small part because of his mother. So, Tennessee becomes that 36th state in part because of the victory gardens, in part because of the advocacy, in part because of the women's groups who are going to meet in Nashville and in other parts of the state. Think about women like Ann Dallas Dudley or Carrie Catt or Abby Milton, or there's a number of these women who are going to be involved in this. And so what I want you to take away from that is that it's a Herculean task to get Tennessee across that threshold so that women have the right to vote in the state of Tennessee and everywhere else for that matter. So I think when you consider, the activity, the sheer scale of activity, it is impressive. It is very impressive. And it shows what can be done when there is popular demand for a certain direction. And of course, we are 100 years later struggling to deal with intense questions and complicated questions regarding democracy, citizenship, who should count and who shouldn't, and things of that nature. And that was even before our election last week. And so the ramifications of this is that World War I has the ability to put women over the top, not just in Tennessee, but nationally. And to that end, It allows for women to become full partners politically within the framework of the American system and experiences. And it will open the door for women to become increasingly influential in American politics going forward. And so over the period of the next 100 years, we see women becoming arguably the most coveted group in the country, simply because of the sheer economic and political power that they hold, not to mention that by the 2010s, women are often outperforming men in educational attainment and skill set. So I'm going to move on a little bit here from the suffrage issue, because once you get past suffrage, there are disagreements within women's rights in Tennessee and across the nation that revolve around the direction of women's rights from there, as well as they have the right to vote. So there's kind of a situation, feeling for a few, some of now what, right? Now what do we do? Now where do we go? What happens to the movement next? And so there's some cleavages within the movement after that is going to go all the way into the 1970s and 80s. The next major event that I want you to think about is World War II. And all of these are part of this development of women's rights and women's history here in Tennessee and across the country. And so World War II does a couple things in terms of women's rights long term that are very important. One, it opens the doors to women going into the workplace in the state of Tennessee. Secondly, it's going to not only open those doors, but long term open those doors to higher education in the state of Tennessee that weren't always available, not just to women, but to men as well. And then lastly, between the end of the war and the 1980s, a liberalization of some aspects of Tennessee politics and the issue of greater demand over time for civil rights. The Second World War also has the impact of developing parts of the state. You can think about Oak Ridge, for example, Knoxville, you can think about parts of Memphis, and other areas of the state that are impacted by this, or, Clarksville, et cetera, because of the presence of the military. After World War II, most of the civil rights attention is going to be placed on the issue of African Americans. Now, this issue of African Americans and women, they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, in many respects, they're joined and tied at the hip. And so when I talk about civil rights, understand that women's rights are often going to use, beginning as early as the First World War, but now, especially after the Second World War, they are going to use the example and African American civil rights to push forward women's rights. And so specifically the issue of nonviolent protest, issues regarding not only nonviolent protest, but moral suasion, bringing in different groups to help promote their own interests. So, for example, we're going to see African Americans support women's rights, although there'll be some issues there, which I'll discuss later. We're going to see a lot of white men come around to the idea that women need greater rights and deserve greater rights. The issue of moral suasion, of bringing them on and bringing outsiders in the form of media, observers, politicians, to help buttress and support the movement for women's rights. Now, when we think about that in terms of African American civil rights, arguably the most important events in terms of legal history are Brown v. Board of Education, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But for our purposes, the most important development here for women's rights is the issue of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This act was promoted and pushed on to the Congress in 1963 by President Kennedy, who had been under great pressure from African American civil rights groups to do something meaningful and, of course, legislatively about the condition of African Americans in this country, specifically addressing the issues of discrimination and lynching and other bad actions, particularly in the South, but also in other areas. As the civil rights movement moved forward after President Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, under the expert hand of Lyndon Baines Johnson, it goes in the House before Howard Smith's committee, in which they are marking it up, they're looking at it, and he slips in a word, sex. And this issue of sex is very important. He was not necessarily supportive of civil rights, he was more of segregationist, but the issue is he had been thinking about this for a while. On one hand, supportive of it. On the other hand, the other half of him thinking that it would submarine the whole act as a whole. But what it ends up doing is that it ends up passing in no small part because Johnson twists every single arm that he can and is able to eke out a victory there. And so in the summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed and signed into law, in which discrimination, which was banned against African Americans, also bans it on the issue of sex, on the issue of genders, of women. And this is a huge achievement there for women. It's going to do a couple of things. One, women are included in this non-discriminatory law, right? This mandate from the federal government, signed by the president and passed by the Congress. It's also going to force the states to consider their own laws and consider whether their laws meet or fail to meet or exceed what the new federal standards are in regard to sex. And so this issue had a precursor somewhat in terms of President Kennedy's look at women with Eleanor Roosevelt and a commission that he put together. But in Tennessee, what it's going to do is force the state to look very carefully at what it's going to do going forward. And for those first several years, there is progress. There are several commissions that are formed by governors of the state that are going to look at, what laws should be on the books, what shouldn't be on the books, how do we promote the interest of women, so on and so forth. They're going to create commissions on the status of women in the state of Tennessee to investigate in part this and to promote dialogue and information and new developments and things of that nature. The Commission on the Status of Civil Rights, status of women, in which 11 are going to be appointed by Governor Winfield Dunn, are going to inform women of their rights. They're going to tell them what their rights are. They're going to lobby before the legislature for an updating of laws. They're going to do workshops and create workshops and promote workshops that are going to deal with critical issues regarding women's rights. And of course, they're going to support early on the issue of an Equal Rights Amendment going forward. Now, there are limits there to some of this progress, which I'm going to discuss here in a second, but I do want to throw that out there. Now, I'll come back to that here in a second, but let me move on just for a second, that this is a part of a larger national framework of liberal reform in which most of the, if not all of the blatant forms of discrimination at that time were removed by Congress and state legislatures, including the state of Tennessee. Courts around the country, state courts, federal courts, began striking down laws considered unconstitutional. Lawsuits were filed in case after case after case after case, including here in Tennessee, in which one part with the Geyer issue down in Nashville with Rita Geyer, in which part of the issue there was gender, not just race, but gender as well. So these lawsuits are going to fall upon this movement. And so it's going to make a lot of change very quickly on one hand, but it doesn't mean everybody's happy about it, nor does it mean that all things are going to work out well. So on one hand, you have, for example, the women are going to be able to hold, particularly married women, hold titles for property, maternity leave issues, seniority rules, funding issues in terms of education and extracurricular activities. I'm specifically talking about Title IX of the educational amendments from 1972, which prohibited, discrimination in education and in sports or anything that deemed benefit women that were receiving financial assistance from the federal government. And so that's important in terms of some of these developments here, but we also have a couple other things that are important to recognize too, is that the combination of desegregated schools, the push for it, the GI Bill, which allows many Tennesseans to gain a college education, further developing the state politically and culturally, as well as economically play a role, as well as the industry that I mentioned, and of course, college women's activism across the state, from the Tri-Cities down to Memphis and everywhere in between. And so what I'm talking about there in terms of activism is that young women becoming active in civil rights, women becoming active in free speech, women becoming active in women's rights, women becoming active and promoting, different notions of what it means to be liberated, what it means to be free in the 1960s. Now, let me come back here just for a second to the issue of blowback or backlash to it. Much like civil rights, there is a backlash to these developments over the previous 50 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so what I mean there is that there are people in Tennessee, as well as the other parts of the country, that believe that there's been too much progress, that it's gone too far, and that there needs to be a stop there. For example, in Tennessee, there is support early on for the ERA, but the deeper you get into the 1970s, the more complicated that issue becomes, the more complicated that issue is nationally, and the greater the blowback that you see from people like Bill Shapley and others who are arguing, not to mention the evangelical crowd, who are saying that this social engineering that is underway is damaging to the family, it's damaging to our politics, it's damaging to the home, and it shouldn't be allowed to take place, right? That something has to be done. And so while you have mainstream Democrats, you have mainstream Republicans, largely at the beginning of the 1970s in support of it, by the end of the decade, the beginning of the Reagan administration, that sense of support is going to go away. And for example, the Tennessee Convention on the Status for Women is going to go away by 1981 as the sunset laws take effect and it loses its political support. And so what I'm asking you to think about here is a good 60-year period, in no small part, which there's incredible development in the state. There's incredible activism over a period of time, but Tennessee still lags behind many other states in terms of promoting these issues. However, to that end, it does not mean that women are exempted in any meaningful way from public life. And quite the contrary, they are, in fact, an active participant in Tennessee politics. For example, we see early on, Roberta Church from Memphis, a daughter of Robert Church Jr., and the Church family, which is one of the wealthiest in the early 20th century Black families in the country, and especially in the South, and may have been the first millionaire in the South, becomes the first Black woman to be elected in Tennessee to the Tennessee Republican State Executive Committee. I don't think that would happen today. Number one, that she would have been a Democrat today. But secondly, there have been some other issues because of the moderation of the Republican Party on key issues compared to where the Republican Party is today. She also served during the 1950s as a consultant for the Eisenhower administration before she went on to serve the departments of HUE and HHS during the 60s and 70s, eventually retiring in the first term of the Reagan administration. Other women are becoming active in Tennessee politics and Tennessee political life as well. We see this with the first elected woman in the state of Tennessee to be elected to a House seat in Chattanooga, where Congresswoman Marilyn Lloyd was elected in 1974 and would serve 10 terms until she retired in 1995 and was succeeded by Zach Wamp. By 78, we're not only looking at the first woman in Congress who has been elected, but we're also looking at the first woman who's a Democratic nominee for the United States Senate, Jane Eskin, and who's also going to be the first woman elected to the Tennessee Public Service Commission, which is now, I believe, the Tennessee Regulatory Commission. But the point is, she will be the first elected to that. And she'll be the first woman to chair the Tennessee Democratic Party. This goes along with other developments in the state in the 1960s and 70s in which women are not only becoming increasingly active, but you're seeing developments that are going to facilitate that. One, by the end of the 1970s, you see a focus on kindergarten education as well as educational credentials across the state for teachers. You see greater emphasis on universities, which women are going to be a part of, so especially from the 60s onward, and from East Tennessee State University, where I'm at, to the university, or then Memphis State University, Tennessee Tech, Tennessee State, Middle Tennessee, Alston P, et cetera. And that doesn't even get into the UT system in Chattanooga, Knoxville, Martin. So there's a greater emphasis on putting an emphasis on education, including women, which helps to develop that infrastructure for women to succeed, especially as you get towards the end of the century. Women do not fare as well in terms of elected office in the legislature. Even in 2019, women only make up about 15% of the Tennessee legislature. And Tennessee did not have a female speaker of the Senate, Speaker of the House, until Beth Harwell in 2011. Now, what type of women are getting involved in American Tennessee politics in that second half of the 20th century? These tend to be women who have been married, women who have had families, women who have gone to college, women who were single, women who were uneducated. They really go across the spectrum there. Women who have been involved in business, the women who have eventually been involved in law, women who had worked their way up from local seats where they have been involved as either appointed positions or they managed to get elected to some type of county seat or a type of city seat, especially over time. And then women who have been increasingly embraced by one of the two major political parties, both in Nashville and in Washington. And so we think, yes, about Marilyn Lloyd, who becomes a distinguished congresswoman, but there's also other women who have made history in the state of Tennessee in no small part because of their expertise and their experiences. I'm going to mention just a few here. One is Maxine Smith of Memphis, who was a civil rights activist, especially during the 1960s, in which she helped with the sanitation worker strike down in Memphis, which Dr. King went down there for before he was tragically assassinated. She will eventually be appointed to the Tennessee Board of Regents. And if you're not familiar with Tennessee's higher education system, going back to the early 1970s, the Tennessee Board of Regents was the state university and community college system of Tennessee. That changed under Governor Haslam, where he split off all the institutions like East Tennessee State, and we got our own boards, but the community colleges stayed with the TBR. And so they used to have a lot more power, I think, in key ways than what they do now. Lois DeBerry, another civil rights activist who was a longtime member of the Tennessee House of Representatives from Memphis. Beth Harwell, who served 30 years in the legislature, and including her 8 years as Speaker of the House. serving in the Nashville district. Also looking at Marsha Blackburn, Tennessee's senior senator, who, or soon to be senior senator, who served in the House in a district that was the stretch from the western side, Brentwood area, all the way down to the suburbs of Memphis, and then served in the United States Senate, where she was elected 2 years ago. Megan Barry, the mayor, first woman to be mayor of Nashville, elected mayor of Nashville. And then in my district, in the first congressional district, just last week, elected its first woman as a United States Congressman, Diane Harshbarger from Kingsport. Diane Black from Gallatin served in the Congress as well from Middle Tennessee. And then lastly, on this point, Marquita Bradshaw being the first woman on the other side. So there's significant progress there. But some of the most influential women in the state have not necessarily been politicians per se. They have been cultural and entertainment figures or sports figures. So I'm specifically thinking of two that I wanted to bring up today. The first one is Dolly Parton, who I think is probably the only person in the state of Tennessee who is respected and beloved by both sides of the aisle, especially for her work with the Imagination Library, with several governors, and as well as her basically leading the charge to protect Sevier County when the fires took place a few years ago. And then Pat Summitt from the University of Tennessee. She went to Martin, but she was the head coach for decades, a national championship coach for decades in Knoxville at the University of Tennessee until she was forced to resign and retire because of Alzheimer's disease, early onset Alzheimer's disease. So there is plenty of success here, but there is a lot of areas for improvement. And so what we see with World War I is that it creates an opening for women in the state of Tennessee to become greater participants and equal participants to that of men. However, Tennessee remains culturally conservative over the past 100 years. And so it has been, in some respects, two steps forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But it's undeniable that there has been progress there. And so in every major area of the state that has any meaningful population, meaning a well-developed metro population, you see women not just as teachers or nurses, but women who are lawyers, who are doctors, who are increasingly active in their communities. And that's a testament to the success, not just of the 19th Amendment, but of those women and men who push so hard for women to gain not just the right to vote, but the right to first-class citizenship in the state of Tennessee and the United States as a whole. So with that, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to entertain some questions if you have any.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Yes, we do have some questions. Thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. So we have one here that asked, we heard much about the importance of suburban women in the past presidential election. What other types of important subgroups in Tennessee were revealed in the years after ratification?
Well, I think the best way to put that is, yes, the issue currently of suburban women has been a popular thing, but I think we can most definitively say middle class and upper class women, number one. Number two, educated women. And number three, white women across the state of Tennessee. And I say that for these reasons. Number one, those are the groups of women, sometimes all in one person, who are most likely to be involved in things like League of Women Voters, women who are going to be involved in voter registration efforts, women who are going to be involved in civic education efforts. women who are either going to promote themselves, but all too often, particularly in those first few decades after ratification, who are going to promote men who are going to support women's rights, right, over a period of time. And so, unfortunately, to my mind, that does not necessarily include the woman who is sweeping floors on the third shift so much as it includes women who have some material comfort, some community standing.
And there are several different women's organizations throughout the years representing white women, Black women. Is there any intersection there? Did they work together at any point? Or did they influence each other in any way?
Yes, women's rights was cleaved in this way, that it was thought of then and still thought of today as an issue for white women. And so many women, even in 1918, 1919, 1920, were concerned about Black women impacting negatively their ability to get the right to vote. And it's really not until the 1970s, late 70s at best, 1980s, where you see this recognition that Black women need to be included, right? Black women need to be included, and that the issues affecting white women are not necessarily the same that are impacting Black women. And quite frankly, racism among white feminists played a huge role here. And so we can see this with the National Organization for Women, right? I mean, it's almost completely lily white until the 1990s. And because of that, there's a lot of the anger, I think, and dissatisfaction, distrust among a lot of Black women who are not and were not included at that time in the way that they should have been in terms of trying to be active participants, trusted members of the community.
At one point you mentioned sunset laws. Can you explain what that is?
In this case, what I'm referring to, and I hope I used the right phrase, but certain laws have to be renewed over time. Think about the Voting Rights Act. The big issue nationally was that the Supreme Court stepped in and they basically neutered the Voting Rights Act just a couple years after Congress had renewed the key portions of it, including pre-clearance clause. And so when it came to that Tennessee Commission or status on the Commission of Women, or the Tennessee Commission on Status of Women, then it was an issue of, needing legislative support to continue its work. And it just was not there at that time, in part because the nation became increasingly divided over cultural issues such as women and women's rights and the ERA.
Gotcha. In light of Veterans Day, how have women veterans impacted Tennessee politics?
Well, for example, I'll use 2020 as a good example. Here in the 1st Congressional District, we had a candidate we had a unique situation, actually, which was wonderful to see, which is we had 2 women running for Congress, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat. And I don't believe that's ever happened up here before. And it's probably hasn't happened anywhere else in the state that I'm aware of to the same extent. But the candidate for the Democratic side is a veteran. And she's like a conservative Democrat. She's progressive on some issues, but she ran on being a veteran. And so the role that I see women playing in terms of Tennessee politics, Tennessee veterans, is that they're increasingly involved in the community because of their activities in the military. They are less afraid of breaking dishes, so to speak, in terms of cultural norms. And they're certainly involved in virtually every sector of Tennessee life, from the economy to politics to the financial industry to tourism to retail. And industry. Think about the different national laboratories in Oak Ridge, or think about Volkswagen and Nissan, et cetera, in other parts of the state, Chattanooga and greater Nashville.
Do you think that is unique to Tennessee, or do you see that across the United States, given that Tennessee has this strong tradition with military, volunteering for the military, volunteer state and whatnot?
I don't think it's, I think Tennessee is unique for many reasons. I think in part because you can really identify three distinct cultures depending on what part of the state you're in, represented by the three grand divisions of the state: East, Middle, and West. And so I think Tennessee is unique on these things to a certain extent, because you see not only women being active in Nashville in the summer of 1919, 1920, but you also see African-American women and others at the Highlander School training civil rights workers. You see females in the clergy. Think about nuns who are supporting civil rights in the 60s. So no, I think Tennessee is unique in comparison to other states.
Well, we can start wrapping up. Do you have any closing statements?
I'd just like to say thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I wish all of you the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Daryl. And thanks for coming back and talking with us. This was great. Okay. If you have any interest in this topic, make sure to check out Ratified, Tennessee Women and the Right to Vote, for more on that history. That's at the museum. It's a temporary exhibit. It's really great. Definitely check it out if you can. Our next Lunch and Learn, we will have Knoxville History Project's Jack Neely talking to us about how World War I and the influenza epidemic impacted Christmas in Knoxville in 1918. We also have 2 digital programs for Native American History Month this month. So our first is with Amanda Lee Kiakaloha Savage, and that's next Tuesday at 6 p.m. She's going to be talking about kind of a similar topic, the political participation of women in Native women in Tennessee. So check out the events page on our website and also on our Facebook for more information on all of those events. So thank you for all who came, and we'll see you next time.